I think this conversation where it's binary, that convenience versus privacy, I think we are framing it that way. But I don't think that the time is very far when it's going to be, instead of versus, it's going to be and. It's starting to happen because the conversation is starting to happen. Technology is enabling those things. The last shoe to drop in this is government and the regulation, right? When they start to see that, okay, both of these things can happen, that's when, actually the mainstream effect will start to take place, which I think will happen in very, very near future.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. My guest today is Ranjan Reddy, the founder and CEO of Bureau. Bureau is building a trust and authentication layer for the internet and is helping companies onboard users more seamlessly and also prevent fraud and so on. Ranjan is an experienced entrepreneur and investor, and in this conversation, we speak about some of the lessons he's learned from his journey, about solving for data security as a non engineer, how he manages that, and about privacy in a world where it's becoming increasingly difficult to own your data and prevent misuse. This was a fascinating chat, and I'm sure you'll like it. So let's get started on this episode of the Startup Operator Podcast with Ranjan Reddy. Hey Ranjan, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Roshan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad to talk to you. When I talk to serial entrepreneurs, I'm always curious about what they're doing differently this time around, what they've learned to do, and most importantly, not to do. And there's usually a laundry list of things. So I'd love to start there. I think that could be an interesting place to start. What did you learn from your previous founding stint with CubeCell, and what are you doing differently this time around?
I wish I could tell you that there are a lot of things I'm doing differently. I have been now, running Bureau for about a couple of years, and I have a short list of, essentially, the rookie mistakes that I'm making it for the second time or the third time actually. Like knowing and doing are two different things, and that's what I'm realizing, that even those a lot of times your lived experiences inform you, but you really need that scar tissue to sort of gentle sort of rap on the knuckles to really say don't do it again. But the shorter answer to your question is, I think there's only one thing which I'm doing differently, to be honest, which is not pay as much credence to what a lot of the advice which is out there, or take titles or roles of other people very seriously. What I mean by that is essentially there's a certain inherent confidence that comes, right? And mostly, you start something because you have an instinct for it, right? You don't do it because you have done like great amount of market research, you have come up with 10 pages thesis and all of that. You may have done all of those things as well, but the germination or the germ of that is essentially some instinct, something that's connect with you, right? Which are able to first explain to yourself, may not be able to explain to someone else very well. So to stay honest to that instinct and to keep that alive and not have it drowned by other people's opinions, right? So the first time around, I would question myself a lot if I was being asked not just hard questions, but questions by anyone, right? I would take a lot of things seriously in terms of depending on who it was being asked by. So, for example, the first time I was raising money, there was this dynamic between people who fund companies and people who start companies. I took that power dynamic very seriously, right? I would take that advice which was coming with money way too seriously. In hindsight, I shouldn't have, right? And this time around, I think that's one thing that I'm doing consciously more of or less of, is basically just making sure that I'm staying true to my instincts, and that comes first and supreme. And not that I'm not open to feedback or advice or suggestions and all of those things, right? I am, but the idea is that it's always going back to the genesis. Why am I starting it? What did I see that makes me want to sort of do this again? And the reality is that you're not going to be able to convince every single person out there. You cannot make everyone happy. So I think that just that confidence in your own, and conviction in your own belief in your own instincts, I think that's perhaps the only thing that I am consciously working on, or I have been able to sort of do better than I was doing last time.
I think that's a great point. And a lot of entrepreneurs listening to this may very well relate to whatever you're saying, right? Which is they are asked the hard questions and there is always that creeping doubt in the head, right? I mean, whether you're on the right path, I mean, you should be doing this, or is there something else that you could do? And, you mentioned that balance of power, right? I mean, even though it has shifted towards the founders, I mean, there is still that a bit of a power balance, right? So I'd love to understand on that note, how do you filter for advice? And here, I mean, you could take any well-meaning advice as well, right, by a friend or an investor or a colleague or someone. How do you filter that advice and take what's relevant for you?
So the reality is that I'm still a sucker for feedback, right? I'm very instinctive, but I will ask 10 people if I have the time for a decision. I'll ask 10 other people about it, right? And a lot of times I won't filter it in the first go because I don't filter that much for experience or domain expertise until it's very, very specific, right? If I need to sort of understand, hey, how do you deal with zero trust architecture? And I'm not an engineer, so I need to understand that. Obviously, there I would look for expertise. But a lot of generic things I would look for in the valley speak, people say first principles, but in my language, it's more common sense that it doesn't have to be someone who understands the industry or the business. When I explain a situation, how do most people react and what is their first instinct there? As just a lay people, but with intelligent human beings, right? How are they first responding to it, not knowing too much of the details, because a lot of times we sweat the small stuff because we know a lot of the details, we get confused by them, right? But the reality is that in a story those two or three top things matter. So when you explain it to someone and you have them react and you probably get like these, whatever, 5, 10 reactions there, essentially I filter for, again, the most commonsensical things, right? Hey, this is so obvious that I wasn't thinking about it, right? For me it's just that, and not necessarily something which is like very profound, to be honest. So
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, right? I mean, default to common sense and first principles, and not defer to like credentials and expertness per se, right? Vinod Khosla has that quote that nothing fundamentally innovative has been invented by the experts in any field, right? I mean, it's always people looking into a certain domain from the outside, because they ask that essential question, why not, right? Or why can't it be this other way, which experts somehow don't get to that as much. And also the fact that there is ambiguity in an early stage startup, right? There's always ambiguity in startups. There is no perfect information. And as an entrepreneur, I think your job is to figure out these various data points at different parts and connect the dots and paint the picture, right? So I'm also curious about the domain that you operate in. I mean, you've picked data security and fraud prevention to solve for. You've spent significant time in mobile payments and commerce earlier. Did that kind of color your perspective in terms of picking this, or was it something external like a market trend, like the growing internet and payment penetration in India or something like that? What was that initial hypothesis to start Bureau, and how has that kind of panned out?
yeah, I think it's that it literally is like one thing led to another. So my first half of the career, which was in the payments industry, right? So I knew that domain well between India and the US corridor specifically. And when my previous company got acquired, so the acquiree was essentially somebody who used to work for primarily the whales, as we could call them, right? So companies which where it would take anywhere from 6 to 12 months to do sales cycle, but these will be massive deals. These will be multi-country and tens of millions, if not hundreds of $1 million of volume growth that you're looking at. So our biggest customers used to be Apple, Uber, some of the top banks in the US, PayPal, and many other large enterprises. There, while solving the payment problems for them, and as sort of the commercial person, I'm not an engineer, so my job was always, and what I've always enjoyed, is interacting with customers and trying to solve the problems, right? One thing that one would always ask is, hey, what are the other things that are top of your mind? What are things that besides whatever, just the payment stuff that you guys are grappled with and you're working on? And now some terms have become the norm in our popular or colloquially language, but early on people would describe their problems very specifically but in different language, right? So somebody would say, hey, I am a music streaming company, I'm spending so much of money on my CAC, I'm spending $40 in my CAC, I give them 90 days of streaming free, but on the 90th day my conversion to from free to paid usage is abysmal, right? So I'm trying to understand what's going on, and that is, when you dig into that, you find out it's a promo abuse problem, right? Or a referral abuse problem. Then there is a sort of a mobility gig economy company who would say, I want to understand people sitting in my car better, because in my car somebody sometimes in Brazil somebody got mugged, in India somebody got killed, right? And I'm getting just rammed in the press. So if I give you a phone number and some information, can you tell me anything which helps me basically figure out what is the confidence score or what is the trust score behind this rider or the driver, right? So simple things like that. There was a company in the UK who has become a big fintech, but they were literally at their seed round when we started interacting with them. They would say that I'm acquiring a lot of customers, but I'm giving them £10 free, right? Every time they sign up for remittance. And that was the main use case that they were launching with. But I'm seeing a lot of fraud because, people just come and, just game the system. So I'm just losing a lot of money. I'm gaining a lot of traction as well, but I don't even know how many real users I have. So a lot of these things led me, and which now in today's world we talk about either in terms of identity or fraud or synthetic identity or trust and safety departments and such terms. But about 6 7 years ago, people were just talking in, in very specific local issues. That led me to essentially think, towards this rabbit hole. And my previous startup was all about phone number equals to payments, right? If you give a phone number, like in India or markets like India, your phone number really unlocks a new world for you, right? Your phone number is your digital identity, right? And your device is basically just the form factor. So some of these companies, when they were looking to now solve similar problems outside of the US, they were completely clueless. In the US, they knew who to actually start working with. So if I need to verify a phone number or an email or a device, or I need to make a credit risk decision, or I need to do some device fingerprinting or any of those things, they knew that in the US ecosystem, who are the companies that I can go to. There's a problem of inefficiency that I have to work with multiple companies. I have to have multiple data pipes coming in. So my decisioning is cumbersome, and there is a lag between the data and the decision and the effectiveness. But outside the US, I don't even know what the starting point is, right? And as part of my previous career, I had been very fascinated working with credit bureaus. They were some of our biggest channel partners. And what I realized was, like, the credit bureaus, they have only one cool thing going for them. Actually, two. One is because they're regulated, so they get, some moats there. But most importantly, they have these feedback loops. They know I went and tested over Tesla and or Volvo, but they also know which one did I buy, right? And they have these thousands of feedback loops. That's what makes them intelligent, right? That's the information, infrastructure that they have created. So similarly, if one was able to sort of do this, but not for credit risk, but for fraud risk, right, or identity risk, I think that's a huge opportunity, especially in markets like India, which are, from my point of view, digitally, they are first world, right? I think US now is probably second world from a digital infrastructure point of view. India is definitely first world, and there are a lot of markets around India or other emerging markets which are sort of inspired by India, right? And if you take a 10 15 year view, they are sort of on, they are just probably few years behind there, but they are again like ahead of, some of the so-called developed markets. So my idea was that in these markets, when essentially new economies are getting digitized, your digital infrastructure gets built faster than the physical infrastructure, and it has a real impact and direct impact on the GDP right away. So if one is part of these economies and they are getting digitized, and if one can basically play a risk infrastructure player role there is a huge TAM, and most importantly, there is a lot of impact that one can have, right? So who are you and can I trust you? These are two questions that every single digital company needs to answer or ask multiple times a day, right? And depending on how you skin the cat, you are going to have either the smallest number is the $44 billion industry, or it's a, $240 billion industry, right? If you look at everything from passwordless authentication to risk authentication to continuous behavioral biometrics to lots of those things, right? But fundamentally, these two questions, again, you need to ask and answer them again and again. And if one just focuses on these things and goes after specific markets and specific use cases, which are very core to anyone's core infrastructure, which is essentially fintech, e-commerce, payments, insurance, or any of these, or some of the newer industries like gaming, real money gaming, crypto, these are fundamental basic things that everyone requires or will need, and hence there is an opportunity to basically become a very very large company in this space. And like for example, in the US you have the credit bureaus, but you also have LexisNexis is now a $50 billion market cap company, right? In the US, they are the biggest daddy here. There's an opportunity to build the LexisNexis of India or Southeast Asia or Middle East or Africa, right? And if it's not us doing it, somebody else will be doing it. But that's a long answer to essentially explain that that's the genesis of it, and that's what we're doing at Bureau.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So you're like the TSA or the pre-check for the internet in some sense, right? Yeah, and it really makes sense, because I always say that number of users is at some point a vanity metric. If you look at what's happened with Twitter, for example, right, 300 plus million users, but they seem to have all kinds of problems with bots and whatnot. And now we're seeing this whole acquisition drama that's come up, right? I mean, on what percentage of users are real and monetizable and so on. I think it's a very relevant problem, really. I want to take a small diversion, right, and talk about the fact that you are a non-engineer operating in a very deep tech domain, right? Because data security and fraud prevention and all of this stuff, you must be interacting with like hardcore nerds, on a daily basis. So what is that like? How do you earn their respect? And how do you build that confidence and conviction to have an opinion in that domain?
Yeah. And let me answer this with some real life examples, right? So I'll ask you this question. I'm sure you have gotten at some point a call trying to defraud you and ask you for your personal information, right? On the other side of the call, do you think that person is very heavily qualified, right?
No,
I do you
absolutely
think,
not.
right? But they are very, very sophisticated in terms of their technical understanding, in terms of their business model understanding, all of those, right? And this again goes back to first principles slash common sense, right? I've been very fortunate to attract, retain some amazing talent. So people who are excited about solving these problems and have a point of view, most importantly. And I think they cover, some of my lack of, let's say, the engineering or the technical skills. But at the same time, I think when you're solving a problem, you have to sort of get into the every nook and corner, right? So you have to know enough so that you are not taken for a ride, especially in our business, which is precisely the business of preventing people from being taken for a ride, right? And I think there was a quote, I think from Aristotle, right, that the purpose of knowledge is action, not knowledge, right? Knowledge is one thing, but knowing what is the how do you use that knowledge and what action succeeds that is important, right? So even in our business, it's about what is phishing today, or what is when somebody's calling you, right, and they're installing a remote desktop on your phone, right? What's going on there? Or for example, if you're trying to now create, let's say we deal with a lot of PII, right? And in that we have to sort of make sure that security, privacy, one is of the users and their data, but second is of our own infrastructure is paramount, right? Because that's the business we are in, because we are not here to sell data, but we are essentially using data to make real-time decisions, right? So accuracy is one thing, but privacy is the most important thing. Security is the most important thing. So there one knows that, hey, what are some of the things that one has to do? So I may not understand, let's say, homomorphic encryption in terms of how to actually do it, but I understand the action that it warrants,
The
right? That
purpose.
how should
Yeah.
one use it? Yeah, the purpose of it. How should one use it to actually secure ourselves, secure the data that we are sort of guarding as a custodian, right? But yeah, most importantly, it's the talent. It's finding the right folks who know what they're doing, whether it's the experience, whether it's the enthusiasm, and most importantly just the domain expertise and the technical expertise. It's hugely important. So I think I've had to go out of my way to make sure that I have people who can make me look smart. So
Yeah, at some level a startup is just that, right? I mean, hiring the right people and letting them do an amazing job. If only simple were easy. Let's talk about that. How did you assemble your initial team? Because one thing I also know with the serial entrepreneurs is that I think the second time or third time around, they're really cautious about who they hire, and they pay attention to things like org design, which are perhaps MBA things that are scorned upon usually, right, by first time founders. So what was that process of going from idea to product to company with Bureau?
I think I've been very, very lucky, to be honest, because you cannot engineer timing, right? That's out of your control. You can do what's in your control, but it's very tough to sort of engineer that who do you come across and what sort of clicks and what doesn't, right? That, like I said, I've been very, very lucky to have come across people who where the timing has just met perfectly. But I think one thing I was very clear was that I didn't want to bring on anyone who I had worked with previously. And not because I had a terrible experience or whatever, we had a great team even in my previous startup, but it was essentially to sort of have that feeling of, no comfort, right? And sort of coming from a place of discovery and adventure still, right? And getting to know each other as we go along, right? So that was very important. And second thing was, at the beginning, you want is basically a lot of generalists. You want people with enthusiasm, right? And I sort of, the way I usually describe is with the analogy that in the olden days when there were explorers, right, they would recruit people who would basically say, okay, come jump on the ship, we are going to sail east, and this is what we are looking for, and we'll see what happens. And obviously everybody takes on different roles, but there's just a certain sense of purpose and adventure, and then you figure it out, right? You don't even know when you get there what will you find, what will you do, all of that, right? But you do a bit of scenario planning and you go with it, right? So that's those. So what you're looking for is those sort of people who have a certain sense of adventure, self-confidence, right? And most importantly, even if they may not have like a full confidence, but the idea is that they are willing to sort of step up to it, right? So I optimized for essentially finding those sort of people who had a lot more enthusiasm than experience, to be honest. So we deliberately looked for people who are, and there is amazing smart talent everywhere, especially in India. So people in their early to mid 20s, as long as they were excited about the idea and the problem that we wanted to solve, and they had a vague idea in terms of the direction, and they could see that where, what I was able to see, that was enough, right? And the way I describe it is that direction should be enough. You should not want to need maps, right? Maps is something that you will create, right? So, and this is a difference between, in terms of, the trait that we look for when we even recruit today, that do you need direction or do you need maps? Because direction only tells us that you're a certain kind of person, right? You can work with the direction and you'll create your own map, right? You will sort of, be the path breaker there. And there are some people who do need maps, and they can execute really well, right? But at least in the first phase of our journey, we need people with direction, right? And not maps, and then we'll figure it out, right? So that's how we sort of went for it. Now that we've been around for, let's say, close to about a couple of years, now we are sort of, bring matching or mixing the enthusiasm with experience, right? Because for scaling, that's what you need. But for just like the first end of the discovery, all you need is essentially a certain purpose and, a lot of gumption.
Yeah, no, that's exactly my experience as well. On day zero, you have no information, you don't know what works, what doesn't. If you hire an expert, they will try to fit the problem into the solution that they have already, and that doesn't really work for you. So that initial 0 to 1, I think you need to have really smart generalists who are very high on enthusiasm, and then as you know certain different axes that kind of needs to be explored, then you need the masters, right? I mean, then you need the people who've been there and done that to kind of show you the secrets from a practitioner's perspective. I think we have some sense of what bureau does, right? But why don't you talk about a few of the popular use cases that you're solving?
Sure, absolutely. So, what we do primarily is just to sort of step back a bit, right? Today, if you're an enterprise and if a user comes to you, right, on your app or on your website or anywhere, right, you are probably there's a certain user journey. First time, they're probably giving you a phone number and email, which you're verifying. In the background, you're probably doing some form of device mapping to that phone or email. And then you're looking for, hey, is this from the right IP? Is this even a real user? A bunch of those things. Then, if it's your regulated industry, then you're probably doing some form of compliance, KYC, AML, OFAC, bunch of those checks. Then the third step is now money meets hands, right? So money comes into the transaction, and now you're verifying some of those things. And then, should something go wrong, then you're looking at chargebacks or fraud or some of those things there. And then finally, when this user becomes a returning user, you're doing a whole bunch of these things again, right? So this entire user journey essentially requires you to do anywhere from 8 to 12 checks on an average. Most of the companies, spend somewhere between 20 to 40 bits of a transaction just in verifying these things. And most importantly, it takes working with somewhere between these 8 to 15 different providers to get this data, to sift through this data, to integrate, to and then get the data dump and make decisions and then apply them, which your data team, product team, risk team, credit risk team, they all use it individually. So this is a cumbersome process. What bureau does is basically two or three things. One is we take a platform approach that all these checks that you might need, from account opening to compliance to transaction verification to a returning user, all of these things are organized in one place. You can drag and drop and create your own journeys, saying, hey, at the onboarding I would like to have the user do these things. As a returning user, I would like to have the user do that thing. First is you get the platform, which is your one-stop shop. So it's a full stack identity and fraud prevention solution, right? So that's one thing. Second is, an early stage fintech needs are different than, let's say, a large bank, right? An early stage fintech may be more growth oriented, and they are looking to sort of cut down. They're more focused on account opening and converting that, and not so much as fraud, in at least in their year one. But as opposed to, let's say, somebody, a large enterprise or a bank, may be looking to bring down their fraud rate. But again, it's more about where are you in your own life cycle, right? The reality is that you're going to need all of these things. But today, what is the most important thing? So today, if you're looking at synthetic identity or account opening fraud, there should be a plug and play module that you can integrate into, and you can go live with that. If you're looking for an account takeover, UPI fraud, or phishing, or any of these sort of specific use cases, you would on the platform see a module for each one of those, and you would be able to open an API endpoint and integrate with that. Most importantly, the simplicity of this is, if you basically give us a phone number, we are able to check the persona that behind this phone number, who's this user in terms of their phone number, email, device, lots of these things. Who are they as a person? So you understood the persona and you understood they're real and they're legitimate. But who are they as a person? So all these personas, do they map to Roshan or do they map to Ranjan? And then the third thing is transaction, because you're not what you say, you are what you do. So persona, person plus behavior, these are three things that have to sort of come together for us to basically be able to say that, okay, hey, this is a good actor or a bad actor in this moment. These are all the things that bureau today does, from organizing all the checks to running them in real time and then giving you a real decision saying that we think this user is 70% legitimate or 80% or any of those, and you're able to see that on one screen, that you give us one input, we saw these 15 things, 9 of them came green, 6 of them came red, and hence you got the decision that you did. And you can either take and work on that decision, and we will back that with a performance guarantee. So should something go wrong, and if we said, hey, this is Roshan, but it turns out it was Ranjan impersonating as Roshan, and that results into, let's say, a 1,000 rupee loss, that's not on your books, that's on our book. We guarantee that protection. So those are some of the things that we do, and we do that primarily in India. So we do that with now more than 100 customers between fintech, e-commerce, crypto, gaming, bunch of them, but also outside of India. And this basically means you get platform, you get onboarding, and you get fraud prevention. So you get three things all rolled into one place.
Very interesting. What are some of the partnerships you have? Because I imagine that that would be a key part of the product value proposition, right? I mean, so do you have like a tie up with some of the telecom providers and banks and so on?
Yeah, 100%. So there are two or three different ways we look at partnerships. One is just the data partnerships, right? So some of the data partnerships, we do work with telecom operators, right? So we get a lot of interesting verification from that. So if you give us a number, first one is able to check that, is it even a real number? Is it a Google Voice or Skype number? Is it a VPN? Any of those things. If it's real, is it the Geo or Airtel or any one of those, right? And you understand a lot of customer intelligence behind that through APIs. So for example, there's a fraud use case called SIM swap. If, let's say, I SIM swapped your number, there will be a real time signal or real time notification that will be generated. So just the fact that your SIM is not in your handset anymore, it's in another handset and has gotten activated, that's a major change event. Those sort of things that we get real time notifications on, which we bake into our decisioning. So that's one kind of partnership, and we work with lots of different data providers out there. But most importantly, we get a lot of data from the behavior. So we look, behavior is the most important thing. The way you interact with your phone and transact is very different than, let's say, somebody else in your family would use the same device. Or if, let's say, a fraudster sitting in Jamtara or somewhere else is basically installing something on your phone, and how they would even use that device remotely will be very different than the way you would use your own device. So those are things that we pick up in terms of simple things, even like, are you copy pasting or typing? How fast are you typing? What is your speed, right? What is your typical IP or location behavior? Lots of these things. So that's one thing that we do. The other is some channel partnerships. So we are very fortunate that we have one of the largest companies in the identity space globally as our investor. It's called Okta. So Okta Ventures is an investor. So through them, we get amazing learnings and a great network to plug into. So the way we are starting to work with them is through it as a channel partner. Okta is a global company with a global sales force and amazing enterprises relationships, right? So if we are baked into some of Okta's solutions, right, or even their marketplace, and Okta recently acquired Auth0 as well. So if our solutions are baked into some of their solutions, we are able to service, a global audience, right? So we are working with Okta very closely in terms of stitching those partnerships at a product level, but also at a sales and product marketing level. So those are some of the things we are looking at. Same thing with bureaus, because bureaus are, again, their core bread and butter is obviously, or the brand comes from, the credit scoring, but they are some of the largest front ends on the identity and fraud solution. Again, working with bureaus where they use some of our solutions and they help us sort of evangelize those to their customers.
Right. You know, my experience is that people can live with a lot of pain until it kind of really hits them in the face, right? And disrupts business, causes a kind of a standstill as such. How do you get people to kind of prioritize bureau and be serious about something like fraud prevention and so on before the fact?
That's a very timely question. So until few months ago, before the funding winter came on, most companies would say, yes, I have fraud. Yes, it's few crores a month, even sometimes even double digit crores. But it's okay because my priority right now is growth. I have lots of venture dollars, and I'm not going to be the one telling my board that 10% of my base is fraudulent or I'm losing X money amount of fraud. What they want to hear is that how fast am I growing? So most of the companies would say, tell me what you can help me with onboarding or conversion, right? That is where I need to, sort of use you guys. If you have anything there, great. Fraud, when it becomes, when it really starts to hurt me, then, then talk to us. And that's something consistently we have seen. Our land is onboarding, our expand is fraud. Because the moment you start acquiring customers, and we are spending shitloads of money in acquiring new customers, right? Often when you're prioritizing only conversion and not necessarily security, the door gets left ajar and a lot of bad actors come in. So usually in 60 to 90 days, you start to see some form of abuse, right? So whether it's promotion abuse, whether it's account takeover or any of those things. And then we get the call saying that you told us about fraud. We think we have some kind of fraud. Can you start to look into this and can you help us? Especially now that funding winter has come through, people's priorities have changed entirely. So companies who are spending, let's say, millions of dollars in new customer acquisition, they cannot do that. Those budgets have gone, but the fraud that they were ignoring because they could afford to ignore, they cannot anymore because now that's sizable because the growth is gone. So some of those things happen. But the reality is, like I mentioned, it's always about in our business, you start to understand a relationship's ACV over 12 to 18 months. So I'll give you one example of a customer that we have, which is in the gig economy mobility space. About 12 months ago, when they came on board, they were about a $20,000 ACV customer for us because they were using us as primarily at onboarding, and that is also for compliance. They are onboarding their drivers or captains, and they need them to do Aadhaar or KYC verification and things like that. Today, the same customer is about $200,000 ACV for us because over a period of time, what has happened is they started to see fraud, right? So either the captains, sort of doing some sort of fraud collusion or fake entities, or they launched different products, right? So different product needed to do the same thing. So that's how it starts to happen. The reality is that you're 100% right. People are willing to live with a lot of pain, but it's about always the context of it. So that's what we see in the early stage fintechs, and the large scale enterprises, it's no different. In their case, they are less affected by, let's say, the funding winter, but most importantly, the fraud, it means massive things for them because they operate at a certain volume where even if they have a 2-3% fraud rate, it means not single digit or double digit crores, it means hundreds of crores, right? So it adds up to them. And most importantly, they care a lot about the reputation loss, right? Most more than sometimes even the financial loss. So those things also start to come into the picture.
Yeah. So earlier, onboarding was the shot and the fraud prevention was the chaser, and right now it's kind of reverse, right? Yeah. I mean, I think there's a great lesson in that, right? Which is to not fight the core principle of someone's opposition to you. Figure a way to sort of sneak your way inside through maybe like a different kind of a value proposition, and then land and expand, right? Which a lot of companies are kind of adopting as well. And I think in that, I think there's also the power of a reframe, right? Reframing trust as an onboarding thing or making it seamless to grow depending on the journey versus talking about fraud prevention and losing dollars and so on. I think that's a couple of great lessons from that. When we look at go to market for something like Bureau, right, you are extremely horizontal. I mean, you could play in so many different domains, right? I mean, whether it's banking and fintech or e-commerce or crypto, as you mentioned, and even just your usual consumer internet as well. So what is the go to market motion like for a company like Bureau?
So, in our first about 18 months or so, we are focused primarily on early stage fintech or commerce companies. And the idea was that, hey, we have a certain vision and we have half of a product, which is still in the oven essentially. So, we are scrappy. We need other folks who are going to be scrappy as well, right? Or who are going to be tolerant of us being scrappy. So, you're looking at essentially early stage folks there. And you're looking, and our business is about network effects, right? Because if I am able to essentially, so today for example, Bureau, we have verified 30 million identities. What that means is behind 30 million phone numbers, we are able to understand persona, person, and the behavior, right? So I can see this user came to me through this gig economy company, but I also saw them do a transaction in this crypto company, and I also saw them order some e-commerce goods and return them with some third company. So I have a good understanding of that network. In order to build that network, you need essentially, like I said, people who are going to be tolerant of you being scrappy, but help you go build the product, right? So that was the first thing that we went with. That let's go to folks who are essentially early stage, are looking for product. They have the capital, but they don't have either the time or the expertise, right? We'll go after them. And then you start to basically look for a little bit of a logo momentum. And most importantly, what in our case, what we're looking for, data primarily, right? So that you start to sort of build that. Now, fast forward now today, we are sort of looking at about, 100 plus customers. So we have a lot more product confidence, and the network is coming to a respectable size. Now what we look at is there are three angles essentially. One is that you cannot be in front of every single opportunity out there. So you have to be really, really focused in terms of where do you want to have a first conversation, and where are you willing to have someone else represent you, right? And where do you not want to go at all because it's a distraction, or maybe it is a market but not for you right now, you're not best suited to go after it. So you have to make those calls. In our case, what we have done is basically our go to market is about three different sales motions. One is we realize that after 100 customers, not every customer is equal. You cannot give white glove treatment to every single one. So if you end up treating somebody who's giving you $2,000 a year and $20,000 a year the same way, there is a problem. And that is what something that we were doing. So what we are doing is essentially a self-serve automated onboarding, that sort of a model for anybody who's between, let's say, the 0 to 25K ACV. So there the idea is that the product has to be good enough, the pricing has to be transparent enough, and the systems have to be robust enough where nobody needs to interact with each other, and people get the value, right? So that is one. Second is there are certain sectors, use cases, and geographies where you need to look at that intersection, that hey, my product is best for these one or two use cases. I know it can solve for five use cases, but these are one or two where I really kill it. Now these use cases apply to which industry? And again, I can solve this for like all industries because everybody wants these sort of solutions, but these are one or two industries where it really adds most value, where people are willing to pay more for it, right? And then which are the geographies I'm better set up to go after. So we have our own sort of 3 by 3 metrics of that. And there we essentially go after, as we call it, mid-market slash enterprise. There we put boots on the ground, right? And there essentially you have a full sales engine in terms of from demand generation to sales engineers essentially coupled with the sales guys, right? And like you have essentially a system there. So that is one. The third is what you're looking at is channel partnerships. Like I mentioned, you cannot be in front of every opportunity in every market, right? So for example, if we think our solution can be helpful to some big banks out there, and that's where the volume and the dollars are, but the reality is that today, even if we have the best product, with 2 years of history, we just don't have the credibility where one of the largest banks in India or anywhere in the world will give us as much respect as we would want, right? The reality is that we should go with a channel partner who can represent us better than we would just on our own, which is where the partnerships, some of these that, sort of come together. And if that means we are building in India or Southeast Asia for some of these markets, but if a partner wants to sell some of these solutions to someone else sitting in the US and they can do that without us having to put feet on the ground there, that works best for us, right? So for us, it's basically those three things the way we think about. And obviously, most importantly, we are in the business of trust. So we have to build a brand which resonates with trust, right? So that's one thing that we have not done. Like for the first 15 months of our existence, we were in stealth. People, we had a coming soon page, that was it. And now, we have started to invest in sales and marketing and some of these things. So that's another piece, right? That how do you sort of get recognized as a brand as well? So these are some of the things that we look at. The summary of that is essentially the focus, because in terms of at this point, what makes sense, what gives you the biggest probability of achieving your goal, whatever that goal is, right? So in our case, our goal is we have to hit a certain number of verified identities in the network. We want to solve one or two use cases in specific two geographies, right? And we want to unlock X amount of revenue. So there are 10 things that we can do, but which are the three things that we must focus on, which give us the 70% probability of hitting that versus just sweating the small stuff of turning every single rock out there.
Yeah, more than a few important points there, right? The fact that, you can't treat all of your customers in a similar way, and that you have to constantly reprioritize at various points in the journey, and also setting yourself up for all these channel partnerships. I think partnerships are one thing that, I've noticed startups don't prioritize, often enough. I think it can be a massive, massive leverage if you can build up to it, right? I mean, both on the product front and the marketing front. Yeah, so great points on that. When you look at data security and privacy, right, there are certain trade-offs, right? I mean, I think routinely every day we trade off our convenience for multiple points of data that we volunteer. And so if you look at something fundamental like Aadhaar, where people are getting rations and they're getting their government services and this and that and whatnot, right? This duality between security and privacy and convenience and services and so on, right? I mean, I just wanted your opinion on that. What do you think?
That's an interesting debate because people are usually on either side, that either privacy is dead and we should just accept that. And especially people from the Web3 world and, right, the decentralized identity and lots of that. So they're like, yes, it may be sort of going towards an extension, but here is, us, the flag bearers, who are going to fight for it. I'm nowhere on that extreme. The reality is that most people do optimize for efficiency and convenience. Convenience is the most important thing. That's what, and especially digital, that's what we have done, right? The reality is that today, the way we live, we are anyway the privileged lot, but even in this large privileged lot, we live like, how the kings would have lived, right? Hundreds of years ago. We have all the creature comforts that one can imagine, and that is because we have optimized for a certain quality of life, and convenience is the most important thing. But it also, we go through certain phases, right? Because like everything evolves, society evolves over a period of time, right? And the good thing is that because of digital, the society's evolution is much faster, right? So for example, when we had this whole world of, like, going back to my payments roots, right? In India, just about less than 10 years ago, we had 37 mobile wallets, right? Before that, we were just dealing with cash. There was nothing else, right? So from that to not having that many bank accounts and all of those things to, 37 mobile wallets, to now, if you look at where, the UPIs of the world, right? There's a crazy adoption and evolution of the society, right? When I was looking at payment company, like the biggest thing that used to be ad tech in India, for example, InMobi, or Google acquiring AdMob, or some of these companies, these were like the biggest deals happening, right? And from then, the advent of Facebook and all of these things, right? It was all about data, right? So privacy wasn't sort of thought of. It was just, what was the other value. Now I think when you know more in terms of, just as the internet citizens, right? I think, I don't know how old you are, but I was born before the internet came to us.
I'm part of the last generation that still went to libraries for their school projects and stuff like that, so we're both comrades in that way.
Yeah, so you would understand where I'm coming from, right? We had a different view of these things. I think we were far more open for these trade-offs, right? But I think the internet first generation, for them, it's very different, because the dissonance between the offline and the online is not that much, right? For them, it's that, okay, it's just that these things manifest in both places, right? If this is what my offline life looks like, sure, probably in a bit behind a different avatar and a lot of these sort of things, but the fundamental rights, right, should be the same online. I don't think I had that view growing up, and especially when internet came along. For me, internet was a different thing, right? I was okay with, it having a different value prop than what I would expect in my non-online life. I think that's changing. So because of that, I think privacy, security, right, even tokenization, tokenized identities, these things are going to become just more and more important. But I think this conversation where it's binary, that convenience versus privacy, I think we are framing it that way. But I don't think that the time is very far when it's going to be, instead of versus, it's going to be and. It's starting to happen because the conversation is starting to happen. Technology is enabling those things. The last shoe to drop in this is government and the regulation, right? When they start to see that, okay, both of these things can happen, that's when, actually the mainstream effect will start to take place, which I think will happen in very, very near future.
No, I agree 100%. I think we already see data localization being a priority, and data protection laws and bills and whatnot. Right? At least they're mooting for it. If there's an entrepreneur who's looking to start up in the space that you operate in, right, data security, fraud prevention, and so on, what are some things that they should know about the domain that are unique to practitioners like yourself? Those are hard-earned secrets for people like you.
Honestly, I mean, I don't think it has got anything to do with the domain per se. I mean, if these are the questions that they're grappling with, why are things the way they are? And they have a certain idea that, how they should be. I think as long as they're trying to get their arms around those questions, right? they are already sort of on the right path. And then it's more about just studying the lay of the land. You need to know which game you're playing. Do you want to solve these problems? Because in a game, you can be a player, you can be a coach, you can be a referee, you can be somebody just buying a ticket holder. You could be any of those things. But you have to understand, where do you belong in that game and what game are you playing, right? Which is where, which angle do you want to come at it from, right? Because if you want to come at these sort of problems in our domain from a policy point of view, that's a very different approach to solving some of these problems of data security, privacy, fraud prevention, then let's say someone who's coming in from a very engineering mindset, saying that, hey, I think this, there's a solution here. A lot of companies, like especially a lot of founders in the web3 world, for example, they have a very solution driven mindset, right? Less about that, hey, we will solve this from a policy point of view, or this is how it should be, ought to be done, or this is how we will incentivize a customer. So I think that's more important. Clarity on that is important, that which game you are playing and what role you are playing in that game, right? Once you start to have a good view of that, then I think rest, the information is front of everyone, right? It's just that you have to do the hard work of playing with that information, rummaging with in it, right? And then figuring out what it means for you.
Right. I have a more general question around communicating your mission to stakeholders, right? Whether it's employees, investors, customers, or partners. You have to iterate quickly on a daily basis. There are multiple tactics that you're employing, but your core strategy and your vision has to remain somewhat same, right? And you are loyal to that. How do you balance the two, and what has worked for you in terms of transmitting your passion for this mission to the rest of them?
So I think there's some things where internal and external is the same thing, and some places where it's not. One simple thing is just repetition. In the acceptance is that no one else cares about it as much as you do, and no one else will see the things as clearly as you do. Certainly not in the first go, right? So at the beginning, like, sometimes, especially the first time around, I would feel frustrated that, hey, I see it, why don't you see? But the reality is that the problem is not there. The problem is in me communicating it and me assuming lots of things. So I think one thing is just plain and simple repetition, and even acknowledging that repetition, the discipline of repetition has to be there, but you have to keep evolving, right? So the way I would describe Bureau, the mission of Bureau remains the same. We want to protect and accelerate all mobile transactions out there. But the devil is in the, not what, why, and when of things, it's the how of things. And what do we mean? So even like the positioning statement, that keeps changing, that keeps evolving. So I think one is to acknowledge that it is okay, right? One should not squirm that, hey, I was pitching myself either to a customer or an investor like this 3 months ago, but now this is how I'm doing it. The reality is that, you're staying on the same mission, but you're just going about it slightly differently. I think so. That is just one. I think people appreciate that on the go, dynamic sort of transparency and just like authenticity, that, okay, I understand this is how you are sort of going through it, right? You're not stuck to a certain idea just set in stone. So that, I think, is one. Second is, again, in terms of not what you say but what you do. You can be repeating a lot of the same things, but what are you doing and what are you bringing back to support what you're saying? That is something that is important. So for example, for us in Bureau, we look at that, every week, is there one customer story, is there one product story, which comes back to making a point that this customer story tells us that this is how Bureau fulfills its mission for this customer, or this is the product, or this is the feature story. So in our all hands every week, that's what we start to sort of, talk about and bring up. And that basically bubbles up to insights, a conversation, sometimes a debate, right, internally, which gives us a lot of learning, which we basically then take back and report back to, let's say, either our customers or investors or other stakeholders, right? Hey, these are the things that we are seeing from our experience, and it generates a conversation. But yeah, I think if I understood your question, I think, these are some of the things that, help us.
Right. The last time you started up was 2012, and the Indian startup ecosystem was way different that time. I remember because I started up around the same time as well. And so much has happened, right? So much has happened over the last 10 years. I think as an ecosystem, we've grown a lot more mature. There are a lot more second time, third time founders like yourself. There's a lot more money coming into the market. And we're looking at different domains and solving problems at a different level at this point of time, right? What do you think about the ecosystem at this point of time?
I think it has hugely, hugely evolved. I would say India has arrived. India was for the longest time the next best thing, and we were just waiting for it, right? When will this happen? And there were a lot of cynicism around it, to be honest. And I was one of them. I was cynical about it at one point. But I think it has changed dramatically. And I think while India still lags in terms of physical infrastructure, it is still a poor country, lots of those things. And we are sort of on the right path, all the good things there. But I think we have taken a huge leap by becoming the first world in, like I said, digital infrastructure. And most importantly, I think because we've gone through a couple of cycles, those cycles have created density of talent, of capital, of learning, of relationships, right? Those are the things that compound. So I think you and I were one of the, part of, let's say, one of the first batches, right? There was not that much of history and we were not able to see the impact right away. But I think everything takes a bit of time to compound. And now we are starting to see that happen. I have now lived and worked in the US, India, and for a couple of years in Europe as well. The sheer brain power available to us in India is immense. And this is not your just typical IITs of the world. Like, I would say just anywhere, right? Just the hunger, right? The level of hunger, curiosity that is just there is just mind boggling. And people are willing to, like put in the time, put in the hard work. So, yeah, so I would say it has changed dramatically in all possible ways. And that's why I think India now is the second or the third largest tech ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think a few things, right? One is that the downside risks to starting up has become very less at this point of time. So you see all kinds of founders. You see people who've worked in an industry for about 20 years, quitting and starting to solve very fundamental issues in that industry, right? And you see the dorm room startups as well. And overall, I think there's a lot more precedence for things, right? I mean, because I remember in 2011 or 2012, if you had to build an app, I mean, like, who are the five people that you had to talk to, right? I mean, who are the five iOS guys you wanted to talk to? Or, if you were to hire your first VP of engineering, who are the four people that you have to talk to? Or expand to Southeast Asia, and so on, right? There wasn't as much precedence. At this point we have all of that, and that's the sign of a maturing ecosystem. Ranjan, this has been a fascinating conversation for me. I've had a lot of fun. So before we leave you, can I get a couple of recommendations from you in terms of books and podcasts? I have heard that you really love Russian literature and Hindustani music and poetry and all of that stuff. Could you leave us with a few recommendations?
Sure, you've definitely done a lot of good research. So I'll start with music, right? I love classical music, both Hindustani classical and Western classical as well. But there's one, like if you are into photography, for example, so Raghu Rai has this a coffee table book. I think it's called The Finest Portraits, and he has basically taken amazing pictures of lots of the doyens of Indian classical music, both Hindustani and Carnatic. So it's one of those collector's items. I definitely listen to a ton of music. I think there are a couple of just biographies or autobiographies. There's one of Ustad Vilayat Khan. I'm forgetting the name of it. There's one recently which I have acquired. It's called by Sahana Gupta on Ustad Alauddin Khan, who essentially taught, Pandit Ravi Shankar, Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, and all of that. Those one of the great artists that I love and I'm obsessed with is Ustad Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, and there's a French gentleman who wrote his biography. I think more than the literary work, it's more to do with understanding, trying to understand the person behind the art. So that I love tennis, watching tennis. I suck at playing it, but anyone who loves tennis, I think must read David Foster Wallace, and he has a book called String Theory. David Foster Wallace on tennis, which is a collection of his essays on tennis. They would find a beautiful essay on Roger Federer, for example. So there's that. Yeah, I could go in different directions. There's a book called Bottle of Lies. I'm trying to recall the name of the author. But it's on, this Indian company called Ranbaxy. Essentially, we should, like, as just, I don't understand anything about the medical field, but reading that book makes you want to, like, okay, we ought to really know what's going on, things that we are just like unwittingly popping, right, in the name of pills or medicines. We really, need to know, how those things work. So I think that I would talk about. There's one book which I'm reading now. It's called The Key Man: How the Global Elite Was Duped by a Capitalist, some title like that, which is an interesting tale of essentially someone who came from South Asia and basically ends up, taking money from, everyone from the Bill Gates to whatnot, but yeah, ends up being exposed as a charlatan. So yeah, so these are some of the things which are right now. I'm sorry, I didn't come prepared with, more interesting list
No,
here.
no,
Yeah.
this is great. This is great. I mean, 190 episodes, and I can tell you that this is perhaps the most eclectic collections of books that anyone has recommended. So, yeah, I mean, this is fantastic.
Yeah, I don't usually read like a lot of the startup books, to be honest. So
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah, thank you so much, Ranjan. Thank you for making time. This was a fun conversation, and all the best for everything that you have coming
thanks,
up.
Roshan. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the chat.
If you enjoyed this podcast, consider subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform. Also get updates delivered straight to your WhatsApp inbox by clicking on the link in the description.